Why share your content like this when you can share it like this? As you may already be aware, Next.js 13 dropped an amazing new feature, dynamic open graph images, allowing you to render unique and powerful images to create engagement for every piece of content on your site, no matter how large it is, without having to touch a graphics program. There are already quite a few videos on this subject, but all of the available resources that we found failed to point out a few key things that prevented our initial implementation from going as smoothly as it could have. So, we have compiled a list of 5 tips plus bonus tip to help you go from localhost to production with dynamic open graph images and with a great developer experience as well. First, a quick intro from me. My name is Paul, and I'm the founder of Render, a custom software development agency. If you need web application services or product experts to help you get shipped, reach out to us by using the link in the description. Now, let's get started. We're going to demonstrate the concept today with a hypothetical real estate site. The client wants to have a way to share information on its listings in a way that grabs attention and creates enough interest to get people to click through when they share their content on social media. As I mentioned, you don't need a graphics program at any point in this process, but it can be a good way to workshop your initial idea, the one you want to feed your dynamic content into. We started in Figma with a clear vision of what we were going for. We wanted a full frame photo of the house and a striking typographic layout with a few tidbits about the property. Note here the use of the gradient for the sidebar content. The point being that we can rely on nearly the full suite of CSS instructions available to modern browsers to accomplish pretty much anything. When working with Figma for a layout like this, we recommend going to the small effort to name your text styles. Yes, the design is very small, so the impact here is minimal. But if you do, it's just easier to make tweaks here and there to your design without having to click through every single element. Additionally, when you are ready to start coding, toggle Figma's dev mode to get a quick glance at the exact CSS styles you need to accomplish your design. While you can export components directly from Figma, we didn't in this case because of how we're writing the CSS in this project. More on that shortly. By the way, links for this Figma file and the code we demonstrate in this video will be in the description. Let's turn our attention now to the code side of things. Here is a site we have deployed for this project. You can see that we have a list of houses, and each listing has a page. And the reason we are here today, each listing also has a beautiful custom open graph image included in the metadata for each page, dynamically created at runtime, featuring some details about the house. These are what we'll show when we share this listing on social media. We will be deploying this project on Vercel. You can easily do the same yourself with a free account. They are not sponsoring this video, we just use their products a lot and find them to be generally fantastic. Also, we will be writing the CSS as simple CSS and JS, no tailwind, nothing fancy. The point being to keep the focus on getting you the information you need to successfully deploy your Open Graph Images project. Our starting point in this project was the Next.js content layer template because it has a simple, nice layout. This project is of course set up using the app directory, and in this directory we have a layout and a page, and then in the post directory we have a dynamic root segment to display each individual listing. Again, all pretty standard. Note that we also have an opengraphimage.tsx file. This is where we will develop our Open Graph image template. Today we aren't going to do a walkthrough here of me writing the code, as the code itself is very straightforward and there are far more important concepts to make sure we get through. Instead, we will scan over the general idea of what's being done in each block to make sure that you know how to implement. At the top here, we are importing image response from a new as of Next.js 14 module, Next.og. Previously, this was imported from another part of the Next.js project, and I believe also from Vercel OG at one point. So just be sure to use the latest of everything to ensure that everything works properly. To give you an idea of the structure of each listing, let's take a quick peek. Each listing contains the properties that you would likely expect, and then an array of the attributes we want to render in the final image. We also import the domain from which we will be serving the content. This value will be localhost when working locally, and your production domain when deployed. We establish the size of the file we would like to output, the content type, and then we get to an important one, the runtime. Here, you can choose Edge or Node.js. This brings us to tip number 1. Generally speaking, it will be best to stick with Edge here, referring to the Edge runtime, as more things work and you avoid strange, difficult to debug issues when loading fonts and even your image source content. In our original notes for this video, we were going to mention that OG images will only work if your content is set up to deploy using the Edge runtime, but as of the latest versions of Next.js, this has changed, and now the full Node.js runtime is available when generating OG images. But as I mentioned, at least at present, stick with the Edge runtime if you can for your project. Next, we have a little function to grab the listing we are looking for from those we imported above. If you were fetching this content via an API, this is where you would do that. Tip number 2. Know your deployment requirements. While it is of course possible to fetch API content from your OG image template, it is not possible to use static exports with dynamic Open Graph images because the Edge runtime does not allow for static exports. If you are exporting your site statically, this entire feature may not be available to you, so you will need to carefully balance your requirements. Moving on, we have our image component, which is where all the action happens. We fetch our post, load our fonts, and return the image response. At the bottom, we pass in the size and font props. Let's take a quick look at the meat of this component, which is the HTML and CSS, which will be rendered to create our image. We have available to us Flexbox, CSS gradients, typography, JSS and CSS, repeated backgrounds, etc. This brings us to tip number 3. There are limits to which CSS properties you can use. Some of the ones we ran into were you cannot use display grid, for instance, only flex, block, none, and WebKit box. You cannot use fit content for the width property. While background size is available, it must be a string and not a number, otherwise, you will get a weird parsing error. Okay, so we've got our image template built. Let's push it to Vercel and share it. Not so fast. When we deploy to Vercel and go to share our project, the first thing that's going to happen is, well, basically nothing. If we use metatags.io, for instance, to analyze the meta content of the page, we'll be greeted with a surprise. No image. What happened? This brings us to tip number 4. Check your project settings. Let's jump into the settings of our project and select the most esoteric, out of the way setting that you would never in your life think to check for why your image isn't showing: deployment protection. Here, simply switch Vercel authentication off. Now let's take another look at our listings on meta tags. Perfect, we see our image. So we're done, right? Well, almost. First of all, we just let the whole world view the otherwise private deployment URLs for our project. If we are deploying features on a branch with lots of new exciting features, they won't necessarily be so surprising when we drop them, since those deployments were always visible to everyone. Now, of course, they do have to actually find them, but it is possible. If we take a look at the source code for this page, we'll see this weird domain in the URL for our image. We've set up a custom subdomain for our project, and in our case, we've even updated the DNS records to point to Vercel. What happened now? Time for tip number 5. Set your metadata base. Otherwise, your images will always point to your deployment specific URLs instead of your canonical domain, which is for lots of reasons not ideal. Okay, so now our project is deployed and we can see our design. Great. Before we wrap up here, I want to share a bonus tip with you. Bonus tip number 6. Have some place other than opengraphimage.tsx to write your HTML and CSS. DX, when working in the OG images file, is not that great in that you can only preview localhost with an external app. We used metatags.io. Otherwise, you're basically flying blind when writing your HTML and CSS. How did we do this? Take a look at one thing we've skipped over so far. What's with that main layout group in the folder structure? We created that to give ourselves a separate layout to use when writing the HTML and CSS for our design locally. The workflow of writing in the OG image file and then reloading, viewing the source, grabbing the URL, loading that up in your browser, it just gets tedious. You could of course use something like Code Sandbox, but this method was pretty quick for us. So those are our 5 tips plus bonus tip for great DX and production deployments with dynamic open graph images on Next.js. Do you have any others? Or some great social card designs that you've created? Drop us a comment and we'll take a look. That's it for today. We plan to do weekly-ish videos like this going forward, so drop us a like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss a video. See you next time.